Evening. Happy Thursday. Today we're going to look at the cardiovascular system. Today we're going to focus mainly on the heart. We looked on Tuesday at the parts of the heart. We're going to look at how blood flows through the heart. We're going to look at how the heart pumps. We're going to look at how everything is kind of regulated with the heart. So let's get started here. We're going to quickly go through the anatomy of the heart because we did do that on Tuesday. So we know our heart is a transport system. It has the right side and the left side, and there's pumps on both sides. The right side of the heart is what receives deoxygenated or oxygen poor blood from the tissues. And it'll pump blood to the lungs because we don't want to carry around carbon dioxide. We want to pick up oxygen. That is called the pulmonary circuit. While the left side receives the blood back from the lungs, and it'll pump that blood to the body tissues by the systemic circuit. So the two chambers in the heart that actually receive blood is that right atrium. The right atrium gets the blood from the systemic circuit, while that left atrium will receive blood from the pulmonary circuit. The part of the heart that does the pumping would be the ventricles. So that right ventricle pumps blood to the pulmonary circuit to the lungs. That left ventricle pumps blood out into the systemic circuit through the rest of the body. So here is a nice picture of all of this. The blue represents the deoxygenated blood, or blood that is, as this says, carbon dioxide rich. The red is what is oxygenated blood. So blood comes into the heart on the right side, comes in through the atria, goes to the ventricle, out to the pulmonary circuit. It gets oxygen from the lungs, comes back into the left side of the heart, that atrium, then the ventricle gets pumped out through the aorta, and then it goes out to the rest of the body. So I know I told some people on Tuesday, but the size of your heart is about the size of your fist. And it technically weighs less than 1 pound. That's pretty light compared to everything the heart does. If you remember from Anatomy 1, that mediastinum is in the middle of that chest area. The heart technically lies between the second rib and the fifth intercostal space. It sits above the diaphragm, so it kind of sits on it. And 2/3 of that heart is more to the left than to the right, actually. It's in front of your vertebral column, but it's right behind the sternum. The apex is the point, the bottom. Well, the base is the top. And just like how cells and tissues all have an apical surface, that apical impulse, so the apical beating at the apex, that bottom layer down there, you can hear it between the 5th and 6th ribs, and that's just below the left nipple. So here's kind of a drawing here. You can see here, you can auscultate here. Here, it's right between the 2nd ribs, 2nd and 3rd. We have our sternum right down the middle. Here's our apex down at the bottom, and this is right where you would actually auscultate to hear down at the apex of the heart. So if we were to cut you in half, top and bottom, this is what we would look at. We can see the heart, it's surrounded by lungs. We have our esophagus. This is our aorta, and that is our inferior vena cava. So that all lies in front of that vertebral column. So we've talked about membranes before. I know you should have talked about them in Anatomy 1. But the membrane that wraps around the heart specifically is called the pericardium. And if you remember, membranes are 2 layers, double stacked. There's an inside layer and an outside layer. The fibrous pericardium is the layer that kind of holds the heart to the structures around it. Then we have a serous pericardium, which makes up that serous membrane. The serous membrane has a parietal and a visceral layer. That parietal layer is what lies right on top of that, or lays on the outside, sorry. The parietal layer is on the outside that faces the outside, like it faces the lungs, it'll face the diaphragm. That's the parietal layer. Well, the visceral layer is what lays right on top of the heart. And the serous membrane is going to secrete serous fluid. So there's fluid between that parietal and that visceral layer of the heart. And that kind of helps, it does help to decrease friction. It kind of acts as a little bit of a cushion for the heart as well. And that little fluid-filled area is called that pericardial cavity. So here's the serous membrane here. This was part of the serous membrane. This is the serous membrane. And then outside of that, we have the fibrous pericardium. This is all to either anchor the heart to what's around it and or protect it. So there is a condition that is called pericarditis. Anytime we see the itis at the end of a word, that itis means inflammation. So itis is inflammation. Pericard is inflammation of the pericardium. So those membrane surfaces kind of rub together. And if you're listening to somebody who has pericarditis with a stethoscope, you're going to hear a creaking sound in that stethoscope. We also could have cardiac tamponade, and that is where excess fluid is in that pericardial space. So that's where the heart can't pump very well. So they actually have to use this nice long syringe and drain out some of the fluid because there's too much. So the layers of the heart wall. We talked about this a little bit on Tuesday. So we have the epicardium, which is the outside layer. That's the layer that actually faces that visceral serous pericardium, the visceral layer of that. The myocardium, myo is muscle. So that's the actual cardiac muscle. And in that myocardium, we have what is known as the cardiac skeleton. That cardiac skeleton is connective tissue. And it's kind of crisscrossing in many different layers. It helps to hold the cardiac muscle fibers. It helps to hold the valves in place. It even helps with the great vessels like the aorta, like the superior and inferior vena cava. That cardiac skeleton also limits the spread of action potentials. So they can only go specific directions. We'll go into that in a little while and how that works. But that cardiac skeleton is kind of in place to help keep the heart pumping the way it's supposed to be pumping. So here's the cardiac muscle bundles. This is kind of how the muscles come together to form the atria and the ventricles of that myocardium. The endocardium. That is that innermost layer again. And that is actually what is continuous. It's that layer that kind of continues on with blood vessels, as we'll kind of look at next week when we look at blood vessels in detail. So we've looked at this on Tuesday. We have two superior atria, two inferior ventricles. Between the right, or between the two atria, we have an interatrial septum. And in that interatrial septum, we have what is called that fossa ovalis. And I said on Tuesday, in a fetal heart, there's a passageway between the right and the left atria. There's a hole in it. And once that hole closes up right before birth, and what's left from that hole is that fossa ovalis. We also have that interventricular septum, and that separates the ventricles. So we can see the interventricular septum really well here. We have the fossa ovalis in here. They don't have the interatrial septum in here. Just because of this angle, you can't see it very well. So on the heart, we're looking at the whole heart. We have a coronary sulcus. And that coronary sulcus kind of goes all the way around. It's the atrioventricular groove, so it separates the atrium from the ventricles. A lot of times it's nice because when these things actually say exactly what they do. So atrioventricular groove, it separates the atrium from the ventricles. The anterior interventricular sulcus, interventricular, so it's between the ventricles, it's anterior, so it's on the front side, and it's a sulcus, so it's a little groove in the middle. We also have the same thing on the posterior surface. So here's the anterior interventricular sulcus. right here where these artery, veins, and fat cells are located. We also have the coronary sulcus, which has the coronary artery in it, but it separates the atria from the ventricles. We also have the same thing on the left side here. In that coronary sulcus, we have the left coronary artery. Here is the posterior surface of the heart. Again, we have the posterior interventricular sulcus right down the middle. We have the artery and the vein that goes through there. We have the right coronary artery and that coronary sulcus here. We have the other coronary sulcus over on this side that separates the atria from the ventricles, and then the interventricular separates the right and the left ventricles. So our atria, those are the chambers that receive blood from outside of the heart. So they're smaller. They don't really contribute to blood being pumped out. They do have what are called auricles. These auricles can help, they can increase the volume of the atria because they'll fill up with blood and kind of increase the size when it's needed. But that right side again is what receives that deoxygenated blood from the body. And in that right atrium, we have pectinate muscles, is what makes up that posterior wall of that right atrium. We also have what are called crista terminalis, which is posterior and anterior regions. That's the portion, that's what it's called where they're separated, that posterior and anterior portion. So as I said to several people on Tuesday, there are 3 veins that drop blood into that right atrium. We have the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sulcus. The coronary sulcus is what lies right, or sinus is what lies on the posterior side of the heart, and that drains just right into that right atrium. The inferior vena cava is collecting blood from below the heart. That superior vena cava is collecting the blood mostly from the top, from like the arms, the neck, the head. Blood will collect into there and go down into the heart. The left atrium gives our oxygenated blood that came from the lungs. We also have pectinate muscles, but in the left atrium, those pectinate muscles are only found in the auricles. There are the blood vessels that bring the blood from the lungs to the heart are pulmonary veins. So as we kind of look, so we said the pulmonary veins, we have right pulmonary veins and left pulmonary veins. These are the only time you're going to see veins red anywhere in the body. It's because red means they're oxygenated. So there's oxygen in those, in the blood in those vessels. And that's why the arteries, like the right pulmonary artery and the left pulmonary artery, are blue. Because that red means it's oxygenated, so the blue means it's deoxygenated. So we need to send that deoxygenated blood to the heart to get oxygen before we can send it to the body. So ventricles are known as the discharging chambers. They are the ones that do the pumping to pump the blood where they need to go, either to the lungs or to the rest of the body. Because of the position the heart sits in the chest, it's not like exactly center, so right and left are at the same level. The right side is actually sits a little farther forward, while that left ventricle sits a little bit further back. In the ventricles, we have trabeculae carnae. Those are the irregular ridges of the muscles on the ventricle wall. So they make up the different, if you kind of notice in the heart that you dissected on Tuesday, and we'll look at it again this next Tuesday, the muscle in the ventricles are not like smooth and flat. They kind of have ridges to them. And that's what those ridges are called, that trabeculae carnae. The papillary muscles are what holds the chordae tendineae that are connected to the heart valves. The ventricles have to pump. Since they have to pump the blood out, their walls are thicker because they have to do the work to get the blood to go where they need to go. So as I kind of showed, the right ventricle is going to pump blood to the pulmonary trunk. That left ventricle is going to pump blood into the aorta. The aorta is the largest artery in the body. It has a lot of elastic connective tissue in it so it can stretch. So here you can see we have the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, all draining into that atria. Goes down into the right ventricle, up through the pulmonary circulation. It'll come back through that pulmonary veins into the left atria, down into the left ventricle, then out through the aorta to where it needs to go. So here's a picture, a nice picture for you of a real heart. So you can see these pectinate muscles really well in here. You can see, they actually have the opening of the coronary sinus that drains into the right atria. You can even see that fossa ovalis from this picture. And the interatrial septum that we weren't able to see from the other picture, as well as the crista terminalis. From this view, you can see that trabeculae carnae. You see the papillary muscles. You also see that chordae tendineae that holds the valves. This is a very well dissected out heart. This took a lot of time because you can see all the arteries that are and veins that are on top of the heart. So this was done really well. So this would be something nice to study just because it was done so well. So those valves. The valves specifically make sure that blood is only pumped in one direction. We don't want blood to backflow from wherever it came from. So they open and close to push blood out and prevent blood from coming back in. So we have our atrioventricular valves. Those are between the atria and ventricles, as it states, and then the semilunar valves. Those are between the ventricles and the major arteries, the pulmonary arteries, or the pulmonary veins, or the aorta. So we don't have valves between major veins and the atria because blood doesn't really backflow. So we don't need valves there. We only need valves from once it's going from the atria to the ventricles and then the ventricles out. So here's a view of all the valves. These are some pretty good cuts here. In the back, we have the pulmonary valve. You can see the aortic valve is even bigger. The tricuspid valve in the right, between the right atria and ventricle, and the mitral valve in the left between the atrium and the ventricle. So those AV valves or atrioventricular valves, they prevent backflow to the atrium. So that right atrioventricular valve is the tricuspid. Tri for 3, so it has 3 cusps. The mitral is on the left. It can also be called the bicuspid valve. Bi for 2 cusps, and it's on the left side. And as we pointed out in those pictures, the chordae tendineae are what holds those atrioventricular valves to the papillary muscles. And they help to hold those flasps closed and prevent blood to go back from those that just went into those ventricles to go back into the atria. So here is a scope into somebody's heart. On the left-hand side here, you can see these are really nice papillary muscles. You can see really well the chordae tendineae, how nicely they are attached to the valves in there. And then we have a dissected out heart. You can still see those chordae tendineae really well. You can still see those papillary muscles. You see them on this side as well over here. You can see them back there and here. So these papillary muscles are helping to hold the valves closed and helps to open them. So when blood is returning to the heart, it starts to put pressure on that AV valve. As the pressure continues to increase, it'll cause those valves to open. That causes the ventricles to fill. And the valves, those flaps of the valves will stay open. The atria will contract, forcing the additional blood into the ventricles. So whatever is still in that atria will contract and push whatever's left into the ventricles, then that flask closes. Once that valve closes, the ventricles will contract. And that forces these AV valves to open. The AV valves to close, sorry, and then the semilunar valves to open. Circled the right thing, said the wrong thing. So those semilunar valves will open as the ventricles start to contract, because that provides too much pressure onto that AV valve or the semilunar valve, which forces it to open. So here's all of our valves again, another view. But these semilunar valves the pulmonary and the aortic valve, they also prevent backflow of blood. So they also open and close, as I said, with pressure changes. The semilunar valves have 3 cusps to them. They're semilunar because they're kind of in the shape of a half moon. That pulmonary is on the right side. It goes to the pulmonary trunk. The aortic valve is between that left ventricle and that aorta. So the name of the valve is where the blood spits out to. So that pressure causes the valves to open as the ventricles contract and the blood goes out. And as after the ventricles finish contracting, those valves close and it prevents the blood from spilling back into the heart. We do not want that. So there's some conditions that actually weaken the heart muscle, the heart valves, and can cause lots of problems. We have incompetent valve, the name of it. If you have an incompetent valve, it doesn't close all the way and it causes blood to actually flow back into the heart, or could cause it to flow back into the atria from the ventricles. So that heart would be repumping that same blood multiple times. We also have valvular stenosis. It's when the valves stiffen, so they don't open well. So the heart ends up having to pump even harder. And when the heart pumps even harder, it can cause even more problems. So they have different ways to fix these. They may put in a mechanical valve, an animal valve, or if they can find a good cadaver valve, they may use one of those to replace an incompetent or a stenotic valve. So I have the entire pathway of the blood through the heart written out here on the slides. This is the right side. Goes from the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and coronary sulcus or sinus. They all drain into the right atrium. They go through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle, to the pulmonary semilunar valve, to the pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries, the lungs. Then the lungs, the blood gets transferred from the pulmonary arteries to the pulmonary veins that come back to the heart, to the left atrium. They go through the mitral valve, to the left ventricle, to the aortic semilunar valve, to the aorta, which goes out to the rest of the body. So I have the entire process written out for you. So some ways look at the heart as a double pump because each side is its own circuit. So one side is pumping to the lungs, the other side is pumping to the body. So that's what makes it a double circuit. This picture shows the pulmonary circuit because it is pumping, receiving blood on the right side of the heart and the right atrium, to the right ventricle, to the pulmonary trunk, to the pulmonary arteries, to the lungs. This side shows the blood coming back from the pulmonary veins to the left atrium, to the left ventricle, and pumped out to the aorta. So I have the whole picture the whole thing on one page for you as well. It's lots of different pictures to help. It's worded out for what works best for some people. I also have pictures which help other people because different people learn different ways. So I wanted to provide both ways, two of the main ways at least. So as the blood goes through the heart, technically there's equal volumes of blood being pumped both places, to the pulmonary and the systemic circuits. Even though that pulmonary circuit is really short, it only goes to the lungs and back. So it's kind of low pressure because the lungs are right next to the heart. So it's doesn't need a bunch of oomph to get to where it's going. But the systemic circuit, that systemic circuit, blood is being pumped pretty far because you think your heart's in your chest. There's blood from your chest being pumped all the way down to your toes. That's a long ways. So that systemic circuit is very long. It has a lot of friction. So the ventricles, the thickness of the ventricles actually reflects the pressure needed for that circulation. So another way to identify the left from the right, that left ventricle is 3 times thicker than the right because that left ventricle is pumping out to the entire body. The right side's just pumping to the lungs right next to it. So that's another way to know the left side of the heart from the right side of the heart. The left side is much thicker because blood needs to go much further. So you can kind of see in this drawing here the anatomical difference, how thick this left ventricle is versus how thin the right ventricle is. It's much different. So the coronary circulation. The coronary circulation is the blood that goes to the heart. The blood needs a lot of oxygen and nutrients to be able to pump. So we need a lot of blood going to the heart. So that is the shortest circulation in the body because it's going even closer than the lungs. Right next to it, it's going directly to feed itself. So when the heart is at rest is when blood is delivered to the actual heart. That left ventricle is actually what receives most of the coronary blood supply. So that left coronary artery is what provides a lot of blood to the heart. So the coronary circulation, if you notice from our pictures, we have left and right coronary arteries, and they actually come from the base of the aorta. So they supply blood to the atria of the heart, right and left. So they kind of follow that coronary sulcus. And there's lots of different branching of this artery, so everybody's different. That's why it's fun sometimes to look at cadavers, because every single body is so different. Every single heart is different in the way that these arteries present themselves. So arteries contain anastomoses or junctions. So it's a way for blood to get from one place to the next is to follow this anastomosis. So that left coronary artery will supply the interventricular septum, anterior ventricular walls, left atrium, and the posterior wall of the left ventricle. And then it branches into the anterior interventricular artery and a circumflex artery. That right coronary artery will supply the right atrium, most of the right ventricles, and then it also branches into a right marginal artery and a posterior interventricular artery. So those are the left and the right coronary arteries are the main arteries that come off of that aorta, and then it branches off into other branches from there. So here's the picture showing the right coronary artery. It's feeding that right ventricle. It gives off that right marginal artery. We have that left coronary artery that gives off that circumflex artery and that anterior interventricular artery. We see these little things in here are anastomoses, and they're kind of a junction for vessels. Some of them, as they get smaller and feed across, a lot of times these anastomoses, we'll learn more about them next week. They start as arteries on one side, they branch into little capillaries, and then they switch over to veins on the other side. So they provide many places for blood to kind of move around and get to where they need to feed as many different areas as possible. So the veins to the heart. We have cardiac, they're known as cardiac veins, and they all kind of empty into that coronary sinus because that coronary sinus empties into the right atrium. So we have the great cardiac vein, middle cardiac vein, and small cardiac vein. Great cardiac vein is in the anterior interventricular sulcus. The middle cardiac vein is in the posterior interventricular sulcus. And the small cardiac vein, it's kind of inferior. It's kind of in the inferior. I'll show you on a picture here. And then we have several anterior cardiac veins that technically empty right into that right atria. So if we see here, we have the great cardiac vein, middle cardiac vein, small cardiac vein, that coronary sinus in the back. This is where they all kind of drain to. So they kind of go back, wrap around, and go into that sinus. This one goes back around, wraps into that sinus. So does this one. But then we have these anterior cardiac veins on the side over here. They all kind of just drain into that right atrium. So here's a picture of the posterior part of the heart. We have that coronary sinus. We have the middle cardiac vein that sits with the posterior interventricular artery. We get the great cardiac vein from this view. Not all veins or arteries have names. Like this one is the posterior vein of the left ventricle. No specific name. It's just the larger vessels that really get names. So we have the right coronary artery. We have the right or the left coronary artery over here. So we've got lots of arteries and veins feeding this heart. So what happens if we're not getting enough blood supply to the heart? If we're not getting enough blood supply to the heart, we can get what is called angina pectoris. Angina pectoris causes the cells to weaken because they're not getting enough blood supply. They're not getting enough oxygen to contract. We can also have a myocardial infarction. That is the medical term for a heart attack. That's because there's a blockage in one of the blood vessels to the vein, which causes that cardiac tissue or cardiac cells to die. They get repaired with scar tissue. I was reading some cool research the other day about that. Because there's a lot of different stem cells in the body, and stem cells can turn into any kind of cell that they need to. So there's some new research coming out that shows that stem cells can actually, after a heart attack, can actually get into the bloodstream, get to the heart, and they try to attempt to remake cardiac cells. So your body tries to fix it, but the heart cells really don't replace very well. Not really well at all. So, but your body tries to fix it, at least. They send some cells to the heart to try to fix it with cardiac muscle, but we end up with scar tissue most of the time. So let's look at the fibers that make up the heart. So we're going to kind of compare them to skeletal muscle fibers or muscle cells. So cardiac muscle cells, they were looked at in the tissues chapter so it'll be chapter 4 of Anatomy 1, but they are striated. They're pretty short. They are interconnected by intercalated discs. Unlike skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle has one central nucleus. They have a lot of mitochondria. Mitochondria is what produces ATP for energy. And just like skeletal muscle, they have those sarcomeres with Z discs, A bands, and I bands. They have T tubules. They're wider than skeletal muscle, but they don't have as many. They kind of only enter at Z discs. Their sarcoplasmic reticulum is simpler than skeletal muscle too. So as I said, those intercalated discs are what holds those cardiac cells together. In the intercalated discs, they have desmosomes. Desmosomes are what holds one cell to the next cell. You have desmosomes in your skin cells holding the cells together. So those desmosomes are what prevents separating during contraction. They give a really strong hold on the cells. But we also have gap junctions. Those gap junctions are used to pass ions from one cell to the next. So like potassium, sodium. All of this allows the heart to function and pump pretty synchronously. So there's technically intercellular space between the cells, which has a connective tissue type matrix to it. It has a lot of capillaries. We need those capillaries to help feed the cardiac tissue. And it also helps to kind of connect cardiac muscle to the skeleton that gives the cell something to pull against. So they need something to pull against to be able to contract. So here's our cardiac muscle on the left. Each of these lines are intercalated discs. These are all intercalated discs. Cardiac muscle also will branch. It'll start as one and it'll branch into two different and connect to two different places. Cardiac muscle does that other cells do not. They have desmosomes, which is this whole thing over here on the right. These connections here are the intermediate filaments from each of the cardiac cells. They kind of intertwine together to prevent pulling apart. Now we have our gap junctions. These gap junctions allow the passage of those different ions. We need sodium, we need potassium to let muscle cells contract. We need calcium for muscle cells to contract. So they're passed along in these gap junctions. So here is what a cardiac cell, muscle cell kind of looks like. They have several mitochondria. They have their one nucleus. That mitochondria is what's producing their ATP for energy. You see the sarcoplasmic reticulum in the bottom picture in blue. You also have the T-tubules. And if you remember from learning how muscles contract, we have an I band, an A band, followed by another I band with a Z disc through the middle of that I band. The A band has actin and myosin, just like skeletal muscle, to help contract. So just like skeletal muscle contraction happens and you get that nice muscle contraction. Then you get that depolarization, that hyperpolarization, and back to resting before it can contract again. The depolarization will travel down these T-tubules, so it allows each of these different muscle fibers to get that action potential, and then it depolarizes down the same way, and that depolarization will actually cause calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Remember from skeletal muscle fibers, calcium is stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum of muscle fibers until it is needed. So when those muscles go to contract, calcium binds to troponin, causing the filaments to slide. So we have the actin and those myosin. We have one actin and the myosin. These heads here will connect together. They connect together. This head cocks this way, causing this to move that way. Then there's several of these heads on here. because it's a whole process. Then this one will do the same thing. This one will do the same thing. So it's causing this head will cock that way, this head will cock that way to shorten the muscle. Then this will bind to this one next. This will bind to this one next, and it'll repeat and pull that the actin and myosin kind of work together to pull to shorten the muscle. So cardiac muscle is actually self-excitable. They don't need, it technically does not need the brain to tell the heart to contract. They have their own pacemaker cells. They also have contractile cells. Contractile cells contract. Pretty self-explanatory. But pacemaker cells, they actually do not contract, but they can spontaneously depolarize. And that can cause a heartbeat. That can cause the heart to pump. It doesn't need the brain to tell it to do that. I mean, the brain, the autonomic nervous system does regulate the heart rate. But if there's a problem with the autonomic nervous system, those pacemaker cells are still going to work to pump the heart. It's slower, but it'll still do it. So the heart contracts as a unit. So all of those cardiac cells, they function to contract. So all of them contract or none of them contract. So they all contract to pump the heart. Think about if they work like skeletal muscle, where it's a graded contraction. One starts, the next one will pick up, the next one will pick up, but not all of them contract. So next time you go to do the same thing, different ones will contract. So that's what keeps your muscles letting you do things for longer periods of time. Cardiac muscle doesn't do that. It's either all or none. And we need calcium for the heart to contract. So when calcium gets released from that sarcoplasmic reticulum, it actually depolarizes and opens calcium channels. That allows calcium to enter the cell. The extracellular calcium causes that sarcoplasmic reticulum to release its intracellular calcium. Our skeletal muscles don't use extracellular calcium. They only use the intracellular calcium from that sarcoplasmic reticulum. So I know I talked about with my anatomy class, I'm not sure if other teachers did, but tetanic contractions. It's where it gets like one impulse after another, after another, after another, where the muscle finally just holds that contraction. It doesn't, cardiac muscle doesn't do that because they have that absolute refractory period. They have a lot longer. During that absolute refractory period, new impulses or action potentials cannot work. They may get sent to the cell or the muscle fiber, but they don't actually cause anything to happen until they get out of that absolute refractory period. Nothing can happen during that. You can have somebody knocking on the door, but nobody's going to answer it until we're out of absolute refractory period. So that absolute refractory period is almost as long as the contraction. That's quite a long time. So that's what allows our heart to fill up with blood again. If our heart doesn't get a chance to fill up with blood before it contracts again, we're not pumping anything out. So it's got to be efficient somehow. We get all our ATP from aerobic respiration. ATP is converting glucose, glucose. We use that to convert glucose, to ATP using that aerobic respiration. And we come out from each glucose molecule, we get 30 to 32 ATP for each glucose molecule. Our cardiac muscle has a lot of mitochondria. That is where ATP is produced. It is dependent on oxygen. We cannot function without it. Skeletal muscle can go through fermentation without oxygen. It can find other ways to get sources of energy. Cardiac muscle can also do that. But actually, cardiac muscle is better at it. Cardiac muscle can use lactic acid to get energy. But most need oxygen. So here's the key differences between the two. Our skeletal muscle can use anaerobic respiration to make ATP, but that only gives them 2 ATP molecules per glucose molecule. The heart has its own pacemaker, so it can contract without the brain saying anything. Skeletal muscle only gets calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, but cardiac muscle gets it from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and from the extracellular fluid. So there's small differences between them on how they function and why they function differently. In this chart, we'll give you a lot of those answers. So since muscle and nerves are the only excitable tissues in the body, they respond to electrical stimulation of some sort. That heart technically can depolarize and contract without any kind of nervous system stimulation. But as I said before, our autonomic nervous system alters the rhythm, alters the speed at which the heart pumps. So as the heart has a coordinating heartbeat, is because of those gap junctions. Those gap junctions allow those ions to go through. It has its own intrinsic cardiac conducting system. It has those contractile cells, and it also has those pacemaker cells that'll initiate and distribute the impulses to contract the heart. So those cardiac pacemaker cells specifically, they kind of have an unstable resting membrane potential. If you remember, the resting membrane potential is where that membrane is ready to receive any kind of information. It's ready to respond to any kind of information or anything when it's in that resting membrane potential. And when it's in that phase, it is called the pacemaker potential. So the different phases of that action potential we have a chart down here. We have our pacemaker potential right through here. That pacemaker potential, calcium channels are closed, or sorry, potassium channels are closed. Slow sodium channels are open. So most cells usually have a pretty negative charge to them. So if we're allowing sodium to come into the cell and we have a negative charge already, that's going to make the cell more positive. You say if this pacemaker potential is around negative 70 millivolts as an example. Sodium's coming in. So if sodium is coming in, it's going to start to go more positive. As it starts to go more positive, it's going to depolarize around negative 40 millivolts. So as that sodium comes in, we hit that negative 40 millivolts. That causes depolarization. So lots more calcium comes flying in. We get that huge influx going, and that's what causes the action potential. At this point, we get repolarization. Repolarization happens because potassium channels open and potassium is going to fly out of that cell. And that's what causes the cell membrane to go back down to that around negative 70 millivolts. So that's kind of what happens. Sodium starts the whole thing off, brings us up to that depolarization. And at that point, calcium channels come in, or the calcium channels open, calcium comes flying into the cell, and that leads to the rise in the action potential. It can even get into a positive. The charge inside can even get up to about negative 30 or positive 30 millivolts. And that's when those potassium channels open and potassium goes flying out of the cell because there's usually more potassium in the cell than outside of the cell. So potassium's going to go flying out to get the cell back down to the resting membrane or pacemaker potential. So here's your book's chart on that. Your book uses negative 60. Cells usually range between negative 60 and negative 90 as their charge for cells. So even though I use negative 70, the book uses negative 60. It's usually between 60 and 90, just depending, negatives. So this just goes through the whole thing that I just drew out on the previous slide. So when the pacemaker cells that start the whole process, there's a sequence that everything goes through. They start at what is called the sinoatrial node in the right atrium, goes to the atrioventricular node, atrioventricular bundle, to the right and left bundle branches to the subendocardial conducting network, or Purkinje fibers. So let's look into more detail about that, because the slide that I just passed through has all of this written out in very wordy. The picture makes it a lot easier to explain. So our sinoatrial node, as I said, is in the right atrium up here. This is where everything starts. It'll start from here, the sinoatrial node. These are the main pacemaker cells. So they generate those action potentials. So once it's time to start a new impulse or action potential, these cells will start depolarizing, send information down to that atrioventricular node. It'll then send the information to the atrioventricular bundle. So it's this whole portion right in here. It'll then separate into the bundle branches. That information will then get sent into the Purkinje fibers on either side. And this is what causes, up at the top in that sinoatrial node, it's what causes the atria to contract. Then as it passes this electrical information along, as it gets down into those bundle branches and those Purkinje fibers, it's what causes the ventricles to contract. So you can see where it starts in the right atrium. It causes the right and left atrium to contract. It passes it down to the atrioventricular node, which sends it to the atrioventricular bundle, to the bundle branches, to the Purkinje fibers, and the ventricles contract all together. So it's the process that just keeps happening over and over and over again. So, arrhythmias. Some people do have an irregular heartbeat. And that irregular heartbeat happens because those atrial and ventricular contractions are not coordinated. When you listen to a heartbeat, you may hear boom, boom. That would be one, the mitral and the tricuspid and bicuspid valve closing. Not together. They should be closing together. And that's what you hear when you hear the heartbeat. You're actually hearing the valves close. So that's why you hear the tricuspid, bicuspid valve, then you hear the semilunar valves together. So they're just a little bit off. You hear boom, 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 usually, but you hear boom, 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 boom. You hear like a third heartbeat in there somewhere when they have an arrhythmia. Fibrillation. This is when the contractions aren't quite right. So your heart becomes useless for pumping blood. Because if they can't contract right, then we're not getting blood to the body. Fibrillation, unless it is caught fast enough, it can cause brain death. Because you're not getting blood to your brain. And if your brain's not getting blood, it's not going to live for long. So this is where they use those defibrillation to try to get your heart to pump normally again. It kind of resets the pacemaker cells is what it does. And if it works right, it'll start normal depolarizations and get the heart to pump correctly again. So sometimes it takes a few a couple times, if you've ever those electric shocks to the heart, that's what defibrillation is. They're trying to reset those pacemaker cells at that at the sinoatrial node. There we go. The sinoatrial node, trying to reset that so it resets out depolarizations for the heart to work correctly. So if we have a defective sinoatrial node, it can cause what is called ectopic focus. It's where we have some kind of abnormal pacemaker that takes over. So that atrioventricular node can actually take over if the sinoatrial node doesn't work right. And it pumps blood enough to keep you alive. Because it can pump, you'll get about 40 to 60 beats a minute. You can get extra systole or a premature contraction. And that kind of triggers impulses from the sinoatrial node. And it can cause a delay in the next impulse. If something kind of triggers off, the heart can't fill in time. So that contraction is kind of felt weird. You usually feel some of those. You don't feel your heart contract unless something's going on. Could be when you're exercising. But in this case, you can feel that thud when the heart pushes out extra blood because maybe the one before it, they didn't push out much of anything. Too much caffeine can cause this. If you've ever felt like your heart racing because you're taking in too much caffeine, that can cause some of this. Nicotine, that can do it too. Anxiety, that'll do it. So, for the heart to pump for the electrical signals from the sinoatrial node to get to the AV node to get to the ventricles, of course, it must pass through that AV node. But what if the AV node is defective? It can happen. It's called heart block. So if a partial block is if we get some impulses, or we can have a total block, which is no impulses reach those ventricles. The ventricles will beat at their own rate. So pacemaker cells still take over, but it doesn't really do a good job of it. Because if the ventricles are kind of pumping at their own pace, doing their own thing, we're not going to get enough blood to our body. Those people will get an artificial pacemaker put in. And that way, their heart pumps the way it should. The electrical signals are sent to the different parts of the heart as it should, causing the blood to pump correctly. So as I've said a few times, the autonomic nervous system does have a cardiac center. That cardiac center is in the medulla or the medulla oblongata, same thing. And it can speed up the heart rate and it can slow the heart rate down. Because we have a cardioacceleratory center that increases the heart rate and force. That cardioacceleratory center, it'll stimulate the sinoatrial node and the atrioventricular node. It stimulates the heart muscle and the coronary arteries, so the arteries that are going straight to the heart. We have cardioinhibitory center. So our parasympathetic nervous system will send information with the vagus nerve to decrease the heart rate. So it inhibits that sinoatrial and atrioventricular nodes. So that vagus nerve does all kinds of things. We're going to keep talking about it with other systems in the body. This is just one of the systems that it's going to regulate. It sends information to the heart. So here's how the vagus nerve will work. The vagus nerve is the darker green, or darker blue, sorry. The green is the sympathetic. Parasympathetic slows it down. Sympathetic will speed it up. So most of our heart is technically made up of those contractile cells. While we have plenty of pacemaker cells to let our heart pump correctly, most of the heart is made up of contractile cells. And these contractile cells are what make our heart beat. They pump the blood to the lungs or the rest of the body. Cardiac muscles have their action potentials have a plateau. They can only get so high. Unlike skeletal muscle, because they can reach tetanus. So, for an action potential in the heart, as we've kind of said, sodium channels. They're voltage gated. Sodium channels will open, causing sodium to flush into the cell. So where I said it goes from -90 to +30. That's a lot of sodium that comes in that causes that. Once we get enough sodium in, calcium channels. We have slow calcium channels that start to open. Those, once we hit negative or +30, our sodium channels close. Our calcium channels stay open. Whoops. That's where we see our plateau. After that point, the calcium channels are going to close, which allows voltage-gated potassium channels to open. Potassium is going to flush out of the cell to repolarize the cell. And calcium, at that point, is taken back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum and out of the extracellular space. I do not have a picture of this. So we have our action potential. It starts up, down. Here at the beginning is when we have sodium channels open. Sodium is going to flush up. When we get to +30, here we have our calcium channels open. My sodium channels close. Calcium stays open for the time being. We get potassium channels that open, which allows us to repolarize the cell. Everything will repeat itself. Sodium channels will open as the next depolarization comes. So it's just a repeating process over and over again. Those calcium channels close over here, and that calcium gets pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum from that extracellular space. So, in skeletal muscle, action potentials only last 1 to 2 milliseconds. Cardiac muscles last about 200 milliseconds. That's a pretty big difference. Contraction of those skeletal muscles lasts, excuse me, they last 15 to 100 milliseconds, while the contraction in the cardiac muscle lasts well over those 200 milliseconds. A longer action potential allows for sustained contraction. We want to make sure all the blood gets pumped out of those ventricles and out of the heart before we fill it up again. We want to get everything out of there. The longer refractory period, so the time between action potentials, it prevents tetanic contraction. So contractions that just hold. We don't want our heart to hold a contraction. That's not good. So that's the last thing we want. So here's where we have depolarization, the plateau phase, and then repolarization. So this shows how we get that rapid influx of sodium. We get that kind of a plateau. The sodium channels close, the calcium channels open, and then potassium channels open, and everything goes back to normal. And that darker blue area in here, from here to here, is that absolute refractory period. That is where another action potential cannot start. Nothing can start another action potential during this time. So no matter how many times something tries to tell it to go, it's not going to happen. That's what absolute refractory periods means. No matter how many times something knocks on the door, you're not going to open it until everything's back to normal. So there's different ways that doctors use to look at the electrical currents in the heart. We have electrocardiograph and an electrocardiogram. Since the heart, as it pumps, it conducts the electricity. That makes it pretty easy to actually track heartbeats, to track everything going on. So we use ECG, electrocardiograph, or an EKG, electrocardiogram, both of those, to actually see what is going on in the heart. We get to see all the action potentials that are happening. So if you've ever had one done, they're kind of fun to play with. I got to play with one in school. It was pretty fun. So we place electrodes at 12 different points on the body. So they can actually measure the voltage of the different action potentials. There's different waves that we look for. There's a P wave. That P wave is when depolarization of the SA node at the atria happens. We have a QRS complex is when we get ventricle depolarization, atrial repolarization. T wave is when the ventricles repolarize. We also have a PR interval, which is the beginning of the atrial excitation and beginning of the ventricle excitation. We have an ST segment, so where the entire ventricular myocardium is depolarized, and a QT interval, so where the ventricular depolarization is from there through the ventricular repolarization. So let's kind of look at some of this, because this is what it looks like for somebody getting an ECG or an electrocardiogram. So they're placed at different places, looking at the electrical impulses happening in the heart. And this is what a normal ECG looks like. So as we said, we have the P, atrial depolarization, the QRS complex, ventricular depolarization, and the T, ventricular repolarization. We also have intervals or segments. The PR segment, so from the initial depolarization of the atria to the ventricular depolarization start. Then the QT interval from the beginning of ventricular depolarization to the end of ventricular repolarization. And then we have the ST segment, the time between ventricular depolarization and ventricular repolarization. So different problems with the heart can cause different things to be seen. Or this picture nicely shows, first, the SA node goes off. There's your P wave. The next part is when the atria will depolarize. Impulse is kind of delayed as it goes to the AV node. That's why there's a flat area. The QRS complex. It's where the atria repolarize, the ventricles depolarize. Between the S and the T, the ventricles are finished depolarizing. Then we get for 5, ventricle repolarization begins. And that's what gives us the T wave. And then after the T wave, ventricle repolarization is complete. So it's even provided a picture. This picture is from your book of the entire process and what is happening picture-wise in each place. So as I said, different conditions can cause different waves to kind of happen with the heart. It can reveal some kind of disease or damage, or even just a problem with the conducting system. So we can have very large R waves. We can have elevated or depressed ST segments. That happens in ischemia or in like fluid in the heart, kind of. We can have a prolonged QT interval, which could be a sign of ventricular arrhythmia. So here is a normal sinus rhythm. This is what we should see when we do an ECG. Cardiologists are trained really well in reading this. I had to know how to read these for tests for school. I'm not going to make you know how to read one of these. This is just kind of for your information. because depending on what you want to do down the road, being able to identify that there's problems in some of these may be very beneficial. So just knowing that this is what a normal ECG looks like. This person, their SA node doesn't work. So it's called a junctional rhythm. There's no P wave. So our heart rate's about 40 beats per minute because that AV node is pacing the heart right now. Your second-degree heart block. The AV node fails. So there are more P waves than QRS waves. Because the P waves are they fail to conduct some SA node impulses. So we usually have 2 P waves for each QRS wave. Here's ventricular fibrillation. So everything is kind of all over the place. Action potentials are happening very randomly. So this is what is seen in a heart attack, or even after an electrical shock when things are trying to get back on track. So this is not what we want to see. Now comes some of the stuff that will be used a lot. I use this all the time. So systole and diastole. A systole is when the heart contracts, while diastole is when the heart is relaxing or it's filling with blood. So we have a cardiac cycle. One entire heartbeat is one cardiac cycle. So one systole and one diastole is a full cycle. So one full contraction, one full-time filling. Then contracting and filling is the second one. Then contracting and filling is the third. So each of those cycles is a series of pressure and blood volume changes. So those mechanical events kind of follow electrical events on the ECG. Those mechanical events is actual heart pumping. So there's technically 3 phases to the cardiac cycle. We have ventricular filling, which will happen mid to late diastole. Atrial filling is early diastole. So during ventricular filling, pressure is pretty low. Blood is passively flowing from that atria through the AV valves to the ventricles. The SA node will depolarize the atrium, which will give us that P wave. Our atria contract, and whatever blood is left in the atria at this point gets pumped into the ventricles. Because there's usually about 20% left that the atria have to pump into the ventricles. At that point, we have end diastolic volume. That's how much blood is in the ventricles at the end of ventricular diastole. That depolarization starts to spread to the ventricles during that QRS wave. And during that point, the atria will finish contracting. They return to diastole while the ventricles begin systole. During an isovolumetric contraction, atria are relaxed and those ventricles begin to contract. The ventricular pressure rises. And as the ventricular pressure rises, those atrioventricular valves will close. The isovolumetric contraction phase is when the ventricles are completely closed. So they're completely closed off. There's no valves open. The isovolumetric contraction phase. The ventricles are full of blood, but the AV valves and the semilunar valves are closed. The ventricles continue to contract, and when that pressure in the ventricles gets higher than in the arteries on the other side of them, those semilunar valves are forced open. This is what causes the pressure in the aorta to reach about 120 millimeters of mercury. Isovolumetric relaxation or early diastole. So after ventricular repolarization, those ventricles relax. So that end systolic volume is the volume of blood remaining in each ventricle after systole. That ventricular volume or pressure will drop. It kind of causes backflow of blood from the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, but that backflow, it doesn't go back into the ventricles. That backflow closes those semilunar valves. At that point, the ventricles are completely closed off with nothing in there. That is the isovolumetric relaxation phase. So closure of the aortic valve will raise the aortic pressure. Because as blood tries to backflow back on those closed aortic valves, it kind of rebounds, like bouncing a basketball, how it bounces back up to you. The blood does the same thing. It hits those valves and it launches forward. During that time, the atria fill during that ventricular systole. And when the atrial pressure exceeds that ventricular pressure, that's when those AV valves open again and the cycle begins again. Heartbeats are average about 75 beats per minute. That whole cardiac cycle is 0.8 seconds or 0.8 of a second. You don't need to know these little minute details. It's just kind of interesting facts. Atrial systole is about 0.1 second or 1/10 of a second. Ventricular systole is 3/10 of a second. Quiescent period or total is a total heart relaxation, and that's about 4/10 of a second. So here's kind of how all of this works, this whole cardiac cycle, and put it in a nice picture, because this was a good picture from the book, because we're going to talk about how that relates to blood pressure. But first, we're going to look at the sounds of the heart. Technically, they say that heart sounds are love dub. kind of how it sounds. To me, it's a little stretch, but that's just kind of how it's used everywhere. So the first sound are those atrioventricular valves closing. The second sound is the closing of the semilunar valves. The pause between the lub dubs is when the heart is relaxing. Technically, the mitral valve is going to close just slightly before the tricuspid valve. And the aortic valve closes just slightly before the pulmonary valve. That's why we auscultate the heart in different places. This is where we auscultate the heart to hear each valve. So the aortic valve can be heard. You find that second intercostal space. So between the second and third rib, just to the right of the sternum. The pulmonary valve is just to the left of the sternum in the same place. The tricuspid valve is technically on the right side of the sternum in the fifth intercostal space. Well, the mitral valve can be heard at the apex of the heart. So that's the one that's in the fifth intercostal space. This is to line it at the middle of the clavicle. It's technically lined up almost directly below the nipple. It's pretty close. I was always taught to go directly below the nipple, like at the fifth intercostal space below the nipple to find that. So, heart murmurs. Heart murmurs are when blood hits obstructions. It could be an incompetent valve. It could be a stenotic valve. You can hear those with the stethoscope. So that incompetent valve is where that valve doesn't close correctly. Blood backflows to the different chambers of the heart. And you get a swishing sound. Because blood is going to regurgitate back to where? From the ventricles into the atria. A stenotic valve. We said that stenotic valve is turned stiff. Since it's stiff, it's not going to open completely. Blood's not going to flow through the valve very well. Stenotic valves actually give like a high-pitched sound, or you could hear it clicking. Wish I still had some of those sounds from school because I had all of these somewhere on in a file. So we talked about how the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system will regulate the heart. The sympathetic nervous system can also be activated by stress, emotional stress, or physical stress. When that happens, our lovely hormones, norepinephrine, gets released. And it causes an increase in heart rate and an increase in blood volume being ejected out. So increased contractility. What I highlighted is about as far and deep as you need to know. It could be emotional or physical stresses that cause that norepinephrine to increase the heart rate. You don't need to know that it goes to beta-1 adrenergic receptors on the heart, causing it to the pacemaker cells to fire more rapidly. But that parasympathetic nervous system does the opposite. It opposes. So that acetylcholine, if you remember from skeletal muscles, acetylcholine is used as a neurotransmitter between muscle cells. But that acetylcholine will hyperpolarize pacemaker cells by opening potassium channels, which slows the heart rate. So that parasympathetic nervous system will slow your heart rate down. When our heart is at rest, we have a vagal tone. So your parasympathetic nervous system is regulating your heart rate at that time. It can decrease your heartbeat by about 25 beats per minute. So when you're sitting on the couch or laying down somewhere, your heart rate will slow down. It doesn't need to pump as much. Cutting the vagus nerve, that can cause issues with heart rate. That actually can increase your heart rate. It increases your vagal tone. So what else can our autonomic nervous system do? So when our sympathetic nervous system is activated, of course it's going to inhibit the parasympathetic. But if the parasympathetic is activated, it's going to inhibit the sympathetic. So one's active, the other's not, one way or the other. That will cause an atrial reflex. That sympathetic reflex is inhibited by increased venous return. So more blood is coming back to the heart. And that'll increase how much blood is filling into the atrium. This will cause the atrial walls to stretch. They'll increase in volume. When that happens, our sinoatrial node activates, which will increase your heart rate. It stimulates atrial stretch receptors that activates sympathetic reflexes at this point. So here's some different things that can cause your heart to do different things. Exercise. It's going to increase sympathetic activity because it's going to increase your heart rate. If we get an increased ventricular filling time, that increases more blood back to the heart. It's going to increase that end diastolic volume or the preload. It's going to increase cardiac output. So this little flow chart kind of goes through how everything works depending on what is going on. Epinephrine, if that gets into what happens when thyroxine, thyroid hormone, excess calcium. We have changes in the autonomic central nervous system output, like exercise, fright, anxiety, or decreased blood pressure. What all can happen with that? We also have hormones that control heart rate. Epinephrine, of course, increases heart rate because epinephrine is part of that fight or flight type of hormone. If you think of it that way, and when you're in that fight or flight state, your heart rate's increased. Thyroxine will increase heart rate. It enhances norepinephrine and epinephrine. If we're increasing the effects of epinephrine and norepinephrine, our heart rate's going to go pretty quick. Ions. So we need to keep specific volume of ions in our heart for contractions. If we do not have enough ions, an imbalance in those ions can be very dangerous because your heart can't function right. We need that sodium, that calcium, that potassium for muscles to work correctly. So what happens if we have with calcium and potassium? Hypocalcemia. Hypo means there's not enough calcium, so it's going to slow the heart rate. Hypercalcemia, hyper is too much calcium. It increases the heart rate and the contractility. So not only increases the heart rate, but the force that it's contracting at. Hyperkalemia, too much potassium. That'll alter the electrical activity. Hyperkalemia can lead to heart block and cardiac arrest. So having too much potassium in our system is very dangerous. Hypokalemia, not enough potassium. You get a feeble heart rate or a very weak heart rate, and it can lead to arrhythmias where the heart rate's not normal. Just like every other system in our body, there's different influences, like your age. Fetus, if you've ever had the chance to listen to the heart rate of a fetus, it's pretty quick. It's very fast. I think it averages about 120 beats a minute. As the older you get, the slower your heart pumps, slower your heart rate. Females have a faster heart rate than males. When you're exercising, during exercise, your heart rate is higher, but when your athletes are at rest, they have a pretty slow heart rate. And my heart rate's been tracked down at about 40 or 50 at times. Body temperature. When you're really hot, your heart pumps faster because it's trying to release heat from the body. Because that'll increase your body temperature, which will cause you to sweat. And the sweat, really, as it evaporates off the skin, is releasing heat. So there's different terms for when the heart beats too fast or too slow. Tachycardia. Tachy means it's above normal. And that's when your heart is beating more than 100 beats per minute. If it continues for too long, it can lead to fibrillation. Bradycardia. Brady is a word for meaning it's too slow. So bradycardia is when your heart rate is slower than 60 beats a minute. If it's not an athlete, not a trained athlete, they're not going to get enough blood circulation to the body. But in a trained athlete, that's kind of desirable. And it's a result of endurance training. So it's training your body to go for longer periods of time doing something. So bradycardia in trained athletes, especially if you're going into nursing, that can be normal. Don't make weird reactions. I've had it before, and it almost like scares you the first time you get that. Congestive heart failure. Congestive heart failure is kind of it is a progressive condition. It happens over time. It's not something that happens rapidly. It's going to take time to build up. Your cardiac output in congestive heart failure is so low that your body's not getting the oxygen that it needs. The tissues aren't being met with their nutrients. So that weakened myocardium, that weakened heart, we could have coronary atherosclerosis. That's where we have clogged arteries because of fat buildup. That prevents oxygen to get delivered to cardiac cells mostly. So coronary atherosclerosis, that is when coronary, if you see the word coronary, they're usually talking about the arteries in the heart. So, or that go to the heart specifically. That is what it means for coronary atherosclerosis. So there's fat buildup in one of the arteries that feeds the heart. So the heart becomes hypoxic. It's not getting enough oxygen. So it doesn't contract well. We have persistent low blood pressure. So if the aortic pressure is below 90 millimeters of mercury, that causes that myocardium to exert more force, pump harder. So if we have chronic increased end systolic volume, that causes your myocardium to hypertrophy and weaken. Multiple myocardial infarcts. Multiple myocardial infarct. Remember from slides before, myocardial infarcts are heart attacks. So if you have multiple heart attacks, that happens. Those contractile cells get replaced with scar tissue at each of those different arteries that was supplying oxygen to the heart. So your heart's not going to pump efficiently at all. We have dilated cardiomyopathy. The ventricles stretch too much. They become flabby. They don't work well. When they don't work well, the myocardium starts to deteriorate. It can actually be because of a drug toxicity or chronic inflammation. These can all cause congestive heart failure. Congestive heart failure can either be right-sided or left-sided heart failure. Left-sided results in pulmonary congestion. Means lungs start to get filled with blood because blood backs up in the lungs. It can't get back to the heart. Right-sided heart failure. Peripheral congestion. So blood starts to pool around the body. This causes edema. Edema is swelling, fluid swelling in the body. So if one side weakens, the other side will start to weaken. And it can lead to a decompensated or a very weak heart. So they need to remove the fluids. There's drugs out there that they can use that help to increase the contractility of the heart, to reduce the afterload, so the amount of blood that's trying to be pushed out, that kind of stuff. There's different treatments that can happen for it. So how does the heart develop? So out of the 3 layers that our entire body is derived from, the heart actually comes from the mesoderm. And it starts as 2 endothelial chambers, and they will form a pumping chamber by day 22. So an embryo at 22 days has some kind of pumping chamber going. Eventually, they will develop 4 bulges that will create chambers. Those are the earliest chambers that we have. The sinus venosus gives rise to the right atrium, coronary sinus, and that SA node. We have an atrium that'll actually turns into the pectinate muscles of the atria. Ventricles is one of the other bulges that becomes the left ventricle. We have the bulbus cordis, that gives us the aorta, pulmonary trunk, and that right ventricle. So here's how everything starts. So we have these 2 pumping chambers by day 22. And by day 20, we have 2 tubes together. Sorry. So by day 22, the heart starts pumping. By 24, the tubes start kind of bending into different shapes that give us more of an atrial end and a ventricular end. They kind of fold back over each other to give us more atrium, an atrial end, and a ventricular, and a venous end. And by day 35, all that bending and concocting around gives us more of a heart shape. That's when we have that, foramen ovale here that connects the right and the left atria together, because at that point, the heart is pumping, but we don't really utilize the lungs at this point to get oxygen. We're getting oxygen still from our mother's blood, because our lungs are not developed to start producing any kind of oxygen until 24 weeks, if I remember right. That's when lungs are technically viable, that the fetus could actually survive outside of the uterus at that point. So that's why there's this foramen ovale, because it doesn't matter, the heart's pumping blood, but we get the oxygenated blood from our mother at this point still. So as the pictures just showed, we have a 4-chamber heart by day 35. That foramen ovale connects the 2 atria, as I've said, and then in adults, we have the fossa ovalis, which is the remnant of that foramen ovale. We also have a ductus arteriosus, because, again, we're still kind of pumping blood around, but it's not really, the heart isn't really doing what it's doing at that, like what it's supposed to do is when we're outside of utero yet. That ductus arteriosus, if you looked at any of the models on Tuesday, it connects the pulmonary trunk to the aorta, that ductus arteriosus, but it's left over is that ligamentum arteriosum. And that ligamentum arteriosum connects that pulmonary trunk to the aorta, kind of holds them together. But again, since our heart's not at 35 days, even through like the whole first trimester, your heart's not, it may be moving blood around, but it's not, the heart doesn't do what it does once you're born. So that ligamentum arteriosum that we have as adults was the ductus arteriosus, and blood just travels back and forth through the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Just like at the foramen ovale, blood is going back and forth between the two atria because we're not pumping blood to the lungs and using that to pump oxygenated from the blood from the lungs to the rest of the body at this point, because our lungs aren't developed to do that. And we're not breathing in oxygen because we're sitting in amniotic fluid at that point. So, congenital heart defects are actually the most common birth defects, and they can be corrected with surgery. And it could be, as I kind of mentioned before, that ductus arteriosus doesn't close. And if it doesn't close, it's called a patent ductus arteriosus. So that's where we're mixing oxygen poor blood with oxygen rich blood once the baby's born, because that patent or that ductus arteriosus never closed. So they have to surgically go in and close it. We could also have narrowed valves or vessels that cause increased workload on the heart, as in a coarctation of the aorta. So it kind of turns in funny weird directions. We can also have a tetralogy of Fallot. That's where we have both the patent ductus arteriosus and the coarctation of the aorta. Two things that happen. So that narrowed aorta up here, that's the coarctation of the aorta. There's also a ventricular septal defect, where the ventricles do not close together. That's about 1 in every 500 births. Coarctation of the aorta is 1 in about 1,500 births. Tetralogy of Fallot, which is we have all kinds of multiple defects going on. Tetra, that means 4. So there's 4 things going on with this heart over here. So the pulmonary trunk here is too narrow, which is causing that right ventricle over here to hypertrophy, so it gets thicker. That ventricular septal defect, blood is coming through and we're exchanging oxygenated and deoxygenated blood in the ventricles. The aorta then receives blood from both ventricles. That's not good. So there's a lot of congenital heart defects. So how can we keep our heart healthy? Exercise. Regular exercise is what keeps your heart healthy. So as we get older, things can happen to our heart. Sclerosis and thickening of the heart valve flaps. That can happen. That gives us heart murmurs. As we get older, we get a decline in our cardiac muscle. So we can have stiffening of our heart. You can get arrhythmias because of conduction. This whole conduction system that leads to your heart rate can cause problems. Atherosclerosis. That's where we have little fatty buildups in our arteries, our veins. Could be in our coronary arteries that lead to our heart. It could be anywhere else in the body. Eating a healthy diet can prevent atherosclerosis. I mean, there is genetic conditions of it, of atherosclerosis, but you can still somewhat avert it by eating a good diet. You can prolong before it takes effect, kind of thing. So there's a lot of different things that happen as we get older. Our body just all over the place deteriorates, unfortunately. But I know I said it in my Anatomy 1 class on almost every system. Regular exercise is good. Not only it's good for your heart, it's good for your nervous system, it's good for your muscles, it's good for your bones. So going for a walk, that's all it takes. Doing something simple as that. And that is the end of the information on the heart specifically. Next week, we are going to look at the circulatory system. So all the arteries and the veins, how they work. How we're going to look at naming a lot of those too. We're going to look at how veins are different because veins have valves in them to keep blood flowing forward. So we'll look at how all that works next week. We do have our endocrine exam this weekend. The test technically opens at 12:01 tonight. So you have 4 days to complete it. You have until 11:59 on Monday night to complete it. Also, some people need to hear the reminder that they have homework every week to do. It follows the syllabus. So it's a good idea to keep an eye on the syllabus every week so you keep up with everything. Just kind of a reminder for that. If you have any questions, you can let me know. Otherwise, you can have a wonderful evening, and I will see everybody again on Tuesday.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Good night.
He's having a game. He's got 100 yards already.